Well, indeed, at first I was asked if I want to say a few words about Will Happer. I first say no. But my two young boys encouraged me to stand up here because I'm shaking my legs here. I'm really a bit scared. But in that way, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to say a few words about Professor Will Happer, whom I really hold him in the highest esteem. He's not really just this good scientist and good physicist. He's a very, very fun and kind gentleman. I have the pleasure of spending a week with him and his wife at Erice in Italy several years ago. And you can see the full humanity in this wonderful physicist. I have not much to say except reading one of the few lines that I think is very special in terms of his biography that most of us should really know. I mean, he is not only the good or this elegant atomic physics experiment that he's doing, he's also one of those who developed rigorous theory to analyze all those experimental results. And this morning, I tried to allude to one of his pioneering work, which is actually known somewhere around 1980s, on how to excite the sodium atoms to resonance and shoot the laser, and then so that you can actually correct for the concept of the turbulence in the atmosphere so that your image will be a lot stiller, so you can resolve features a lot better. And that is really something wonderful and amazing. And they only have time to publish it in 1994 with Freeman Dyson, Gordon MacDonald, and I think this person from Lick Observatory. So it's very, very impressive work. There's one more last thing I want to say is that Will has also done contribution to medical imaging, as you all can imagine. So he has a company that actually produces those polarized noble gases for all this magnetic resonance technology that we actually are benefiting from, including diagnosis of COVID-19 patient, I guess. Okay? So congratulations, Will. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm very grateful for this award. Thank you, Dr. Orient, and thank you, Willie, for this. Edward Teller was a friend of mine, and I first met him when I was an undergraduate at the University of North Carolina. It must have been the late 50s. He came to give a lecture, and he started the lecture by going to the blackboard, and this was, you know, a collection of not just physics students, but across the university, sociologists were there. And the first thing he did was prove the Pythagorean theorem. And he says, look how beautiful mathematics is. And so later, many years later, I had a book that he had written, and during a visit, I asked, would you please write down the proof of the Pythagorean theorem that you did at the University of North Carolina? He immediately did it. It's a beautiful proof, which some of you may have seen. It's an unusual one, but very easy to understand. Anyway, thank you so much for this award and for the honor of speaking to you tonight. The title of my talk is Common Sense, and I really owe this to my wife Barbara, who would like to be here, but she's looking after our two cats at home. And but she knows many of you, and she sends her best regards to her friends here. Common sense is a kind of short supply, but before I launch into a discussion of it, the reason Barbara is so interested in common sense is she keeps telling me, you have all these academic friends and you have all these political friends in Washington, none of them have any common sense. And I you know, I'm sort of taken aback. I presume that means me too. But in some sense she's right. You know, there's a real dearth of common sense in our society today. And I hope we can get some of that back. I mean, it's not all gone. I think everybody really has a residue of it, but it's easily submerged in the fury of the day, as the classicists used to say. Well, I was interested today to hear Mark Morano mention Eisenhower's farewell address. Let me see if I can bring up this slide. There he is. And as Mark said, this was part of the address where he talked about the military-industrial complex, which the liberal press never forgets. But another thing that was equally important was what he called a scientific technological elite. Let me just read directly from his address. It says, the prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocation, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. And Jim Enstrom talked about one of the perversions that Ike predicted here. He goes on to say, yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. So Ike was a very wise man. He served briefly as the president of Columbia University, where I began my academic career. And I don't know whether it's true, but apparently when the faculty search committee came back to announce to the faculty senate that they had hired Eisenhower and then said, you know, General Eisenhower will arrive in about a month, and we've got it all set up, there was this gasp, and the oldest faculty member said, but we expected you to hire Milton, you know, his brother, the academic. And so I don't know what that's true or not, but it just shows you the academic mindset. He was a good president of Columbia, and he was a good president of the United States, too. Now here is one of the first praises of common sense that I know about, and I'm indebted to the Canadian historian John Robson for bringing this to my attention. And so this is a comment by William Pitt, the elder, who was a British prime minister, a very important statesman at the time of the American Revolution, and even more importantly during the French and Indian War, which preceded the Revolution. And the town of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is named for him because it was captured during the French and Indian Wars. And one of the young officers there was George Washington. And after the capture of the Fort Duquesne, the French Fort Duquesne, the British renamed the Fort Duquesne Pittsburgh, or Pittsburgh is probably the way they pronounced it because it was a Scottish officer who named it. So here is what William Pitt has to say about common sense. And let me see if I can read this. It seems to have a magnifying glass. Let's see if it works. Not too well. Okay, so I'll try and read it here. Pardon me for stooping down, but it says, there is one plain maxim to which I have invariably adhered throughout life, that in every question in which my liberty or my property were concerned, I should consult and be determined by the dictates of common sense. Okay, in fact, let me stand here. I can read it better. I confess, my lords, he's speaking to the House of Lords in London, that I'm apt to distrust the refinements of learning because I've seen the ablest and the most learned men equally liable to deceive themselves and to mislead others. Where have we seen that happen? The condition of human nature would be lamentable indeed if nothing less than the greatest learning and talents, which fall to the share of so small a number of men, were sufficient to direct our judgment and our conduct. but Providence has taken better care of our happiness and given us, in the simplicity of common sense, a rule for our direction by which we shall never be misled. So William Pitt, he was a good friend of the American Revolution. He told the British, he told George III, this is complete folly, you've got no better subjects than the inhabitants of the British colonies of North America. King George's response was to fire him, so that was that for William Pitt. He died a year or two later. Well, okay, so let's talk about some big issues that we've already discussed today, and COVID-19 is certainly front and center presently. And so are there any signs of common sense in our response to COVID-19? So we've heard a great deal of information about COVID, but let me point out some of the key facts. So what I'm showing here is the total number of deaths per week in the United States starting January the 1st, 2017 and ending just beyond today, a week or so ago. And you can see that people are always dying in the United States. It's a sad thing, but we're all mortal. And we have a little over 300 million people in the United States. If they were to live for 100 years, that would be about 3 million people per year who have to die. And in fact, that's roughly what you see here, that the average death rate fluctuates between summer and winter, but it's between 55 or 60,000 per week. You see, multiply by 50 weeks, you get about 3 million people. And so you have to bear that in mind, that the population of the United States is not immortal. You can also see that the death rate always peaks in the winter, and this is because of seasonal respiratory diseases, mostly pneumonia and influenza are the main ones, but there are others. And so as the weather warms up toward the summer, this time of year, the death rate goes down, and then winter comes, it peaks up again. This was a particularly bad flu season on the year beginning January 1st, 2018. It goes down again in the summer. It was a mild flu season last winter. And then here was the flu season starting 6 months ago, and there's COVID popping up. So that's the increase in the death rate from respiratory diseases, pneumonia, influenza, and COVID. So you can certainly see it. But it's not a whole lot worse than this, which is a moderately bad flu season. And if I extended this back, I could show you 3 or 4 flu years which are just as bad as this one. So you should think of COVID as something that's similar to a particularly bad flu year. Now let's drill down on this. So here is a much shorter plot of the mortality, and this is now interesting because they plot mortality versus age. So the oldest age group here is people over 85 years of age. I haven't quite made that, but I hope to make it. And what we see here is that before COVID hit, which was about the beginning of April, we had the normal death rate from influenza, pneumonia, et cetera, which peaks for the oldest people, at least if you add males and females. It's interesting, if you look at only males, the death rate peaks in the next younger age group. That's because very few males survive enough to get to the oldest age group, so they've already died off from something else. So it's an interesting set of statistics to look at. Kind of sobering if you're a male. But what COVID did was to increase the death rate of this oldest population group by about 30%. And that's true of younger groups, but it's a little bit lesser increase. For people who are under 24 years old, essentially nobody is dying. So if you're a young person, this is, by the way, is CDC. It's from your government. It has to be right. Yeah. I don't think it shows any sign of great manipulation. You know, you can manipulate COVID cases, you know, because the tests are so unreliable. But, you know, if you're dead, you're dead. So I think that the reports of deaths are pretty good. Now, if you subtract out the base, you could imagine, you know, extrapolating the normal death rate here, dropping as you approach the summer. You can get the part that you estimate is due to COVID. So it doesn't depend on anyone diagnosing a death that was really a heart attack or something that had nothing to do with COVID. You simply extrapolate. So I think that's a reasonably honest way to estimate the COVID deaths. And you see that the entire death rate is dropping rapidly because we've reached summer. So it's amazing how much this has fallen. Of course, it's only the respiratory amount. But here's the difference. And so again, you see that COVID took off around the first of, well, what is this? Around the end of March. It peaked very rapidly as for all the age groups, and then it started down. Here's the infamous second wave. It's not much of a wave, but there is a little wave you can see there. But you can see that for the last few weeks, it's practically stopped. People are not dying of COVID in the last few weeks. And this is characteristic of the respiratory diseases as the weather warms up. People get outside. All right, so that's the situation. We heard today many examples. Mark Morano in particular talked about our responses to COVID, and whether it shows any common sense is questionable. But here's one of the responses we're all dealing with. This is today's government issue masks, and we're expecting, you know, in a few months it'll be like this. God knows what's going to happen. But this is really enforced symbolism. Nobody knows whether this is really helping very much. It may help a little bit, but it certainly is unlikely to have had very much effect on this curve here. I think this is just the buildup of, you know, herd immunity, and but we'll see what happens in the fall. But here's another example of government-enforced symbolism. I think many of you know after the Manchus conquered China at the end of the Ming Dynasty, they suppressed the native Chinese under their rule by forcing them to wear a pigtail. This was a mark of inferiority. And so for centuries, if you were a Han Chinese, you had to cut the hair off the front of your head and wear this ridiculous pigtail. This continued until the early 1900s, and it was not until the Chinese Revolution, you know, in 1911, that finally, you know, proud Chinese were able to cut off the pigtail. So there are lots of pictures of the end of this. So this is not so different for the mask. And it says here, the hairstyle was compulsory for all males, and the penalty for non-compliance was execution for treason. In the early 1910s, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, the Chinese no longer had to wear the Manchu queue. So they thought it was useful because it symbolized submission to their rule. And that all those who didn't have a pigtail, you could pick out pretty quickly, like someone who doesn't have a mask, right? Okay. All right, so let's switch now to the another issue where you wonder where the common sense is. So this is climate hysteria. And so the people you read about, Time Magazine has a Person of the Year of, climate expert Greta, and there's climate Nobel laureate Al, with all the money he has accumulated from this noble cause. And is this common sense or not? Well, there's very few signs that it is, but lots of people are benefiting. You always, in all of these things, you have to ask the ancient Roman question, cui bono, who profits? And always someone is profiting. Follow the money, that's a good idea. Is this unusual? No, it's not unusual. I'm sorry to say that this is a failing of human character, and again and again, as centuries pass, things like this happen. One of the best descriptions is this wonderful book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. It was written by a Scottish news journalist, I think, Charles Mackay, back in the 1800s. And it's worth reading today. It was a favorite of Bernard Baruch, the financier, who profited at the time of the Great Depression by short selling at just the right time because he thought everybody was, following a mass delusion, and he was right. And so if you worked for Bernard Baruch, the first thing you had to do was read this book and then get a quiz from Bernard to see whether you had absorbed the lessons from it. But the introduction will give you the flavor of what's in the book, so let me read it to you. Let's see here. So here's Mackay speaking in the first paragraph of his book. He says, in reading the history of nations, we find that like individuals, they have their whims and their peculiarities, their seasons of excitement and recklessness when they care not what they do. We find that whole communities suddenly fix their minds upon one object and go mad in its pursuit, that millions of people become simultaneously impressed with one delusion and run after it till their attention is caught by some new folly, more captivating than the first. Well, we're certainly seeing millions of people deluded. The paragraph ends with, men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. So Mackay got that one right for sure. I do recommend the book. Well, here's some examples of delusions. When the Spaniards came to Mexico for the conquest, one of the things that made it relatively easy was there was so much hatred for the Aztecs who ruled Mexico at the time, and one of their practices was human sacrifice. They would put a poor victim on top of one of the pyramids, slit his chest open with a stone knife and pull his heart out, This was a climate cult, by the way. It was to keep the rains coming. There's the sun, it was held up to the sun, you see. It's like cutting out CO2. So much resentment had built up by the time the Spaniards got there that they hardly had to do any of the fighting. All they had to do was get some of the neighboring tribes to help them who were providing the victims for this gruesome ceremony. And it was a big deal. There were thousands and thousands of these sacrifices every year. So what do they have in mind for us here to save the planet? Hopefully nothing quite as brutal as this. But we're capable of it. When I talk about past follies, another example of that is one of my favorite parts of the Bible is the story of Elijah and the priests of Baal. And you remember Baal was also a climate god. You had to sacrifice your children, to Baal so that you could harvest wheat next year and barley. And the Old Testament prophets didn't like that. Elijah didn't like that. He says this is a perversion. And so there's this wonderful shootout between Elijah all by himself and the priests of Baal just up the mountain behind the city of Haifa. And it's a great story, but I won't bore you. But we're perfectly capable of doing that in America too. It's not that America is special. We have the same failings as all of mankind. Here is one of the most famous and shameful episodes in American history. It was the Salem witch trials, and this is the hanging of the Reverend George Burroughs, and there he is about to be hung. And this gentleman on the horse is Cotton Mather, the Harvard theologian who's there to encourage the hanging, also to sell his book on how you can find witches, so it sold quite well during the trials. And here's an eyewitness account of what happened. So this was the guy here who witnessed what happened. It says, Mr. Burroughs was carried in a cart with others through the streets of Salem to execution. When he was upon the ladder, he made a speech for the clearing of his innocency with such solemn and serious expressions as were to the admiration of all present. His prayer, which he concluded by repeating the Lord's Prayer, was so well worded and uttered with such composedness, as such fervency of spirit, was very affecting and drew tears from many, so that it seemed to some that the spectators would hinder the execution. Now, what's not being said there is actually Reverend Burroughs was very popular. He didn't have a Harvard degree like Cotton Mather, but if someone in your family died, he was there the next hour to comfort you. If you were sick, he was there to bring some soup or something like that. So he really paid attention to his flock, and his flock was in an ugly mood as they were about to hang him. But let's see, the eyewitness goes on to say, the accuser said that the black man, devil, stood and dictated to him as soon as he was turned off. So they went ahead and hung him. Mr. Cotton Mather, being mounted upon a horse, there he is, there's Cotton Mather selling his book, addressed himself to the people, partly to he, Mr. Burroughs, was no ordained minister, partly to possess the people of his guilt, saying that the devil often had been transformed into the angel of light. And this did somewhat appease the people, and the executions went on. When he, Mr. Burroughs, was cut down, he was dragged by a halter to a hole or grave between the rocks, about 2 feet deep, his shortened breeches being pulled off and an old pair of trousers of one of the executed put on his lower parts. And he was so put in together with Willard and Carrier, 2 others who had been hanged, that one of his hands and his chin and a foot of one of them was left uncovered. So that's the state of Massachusetts in 1692. Yeah, all the judges had been educated at Harvard. Yeah. I don't hold anyone who is contemporarily associated with Harvard responsible for that, but being from Princeton, I can't help mentioning that. Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about some facts about CO2. First of all, I keep hearing about, carbon pollution, and CO2 is not a pollutant. I don't know why we let them get away with that. You can't seem to get through to them the fact that CO2 is good for the planet. It's good for plants. I won't belabor you with that. Most of you know about it, and it's also completely natural. We breathe out CO2. Where does this damn thing go? Here we go. We breathe out CO2, and the amount is really quite astonishing. Each of us breathes out about 2 pounds of CO2 per day. And you might ask yourself, my goodness, I breathe out 2 pounds of CO2 a day. That comes from, fat and other things. Why can't I lose more than, why can't I lose 2 pounds a day? I could lose 14 pounds a week, if I just stop eating. And you can't do that. You don't lose that much weight. And so those of you who are good biochemists, I probably recognize the answer. And the answer is that most of the weight of the CO2 isn't carbon at all, it's oxygen. So when they talk about carbon pollution, 2/3 of the mole fraction of CO2, and roughly even more of that is oxygen, not carbon. So why don't we talk about oxygen pollution? It's not carbon pollution. Actually, it's neither one. It's CO2, which is a benefit to the world. I realize this is a general audience and not an audience of physicists, but since that's my profession, and maybe Edward Teller will give me permission to say a little bit about physics, because Edward knew many of these people. He certainly knew Planck. He was probably a little too young to know Karl Schwarzschild. But what I'm showing you here is a graph which the vertical axis is the energy radiated to space by the Earth, thermal energy. And so plotted this way is the spatial frequency of the radiation. So this is radiation with 500 waves per centimeter, 1,000 waves per centimeter, etc. And this is energy going up in milliwatts per square meter in units of frequency, per frequency unit. And so the smooth curve here is the famous Planck spectrum that was invented by Max Planck, and which it was the first quantum mechanics, in history. So a lot of people forget that quantum mechanics really came from the study of thermal radiation. And Planck was well aware of the thermal radiation spectrum of the Earth. And so he managed to explain where this peculiar smooth curve comes from. That's what you would see from space if there were no greenhouse gases. Now, in addition to Planck's smooth curves, there's this jagged curve, which is due to Karl Schwarzschild. He was the one who pointed out how you calculate that. And this jagged curve is there because the Earth's atmosphere has got water vapor, it's got carbon dioxide, it's got methane and other greenhouse gases in it. I've listed some of them here, and they absorb and emit at various frequencies corresponding to vibrations and rotations of the molecule. And the result of that is to suppress the amount of cooling radiation that goes to space. So this is what they mean by the greenhouse effect, that the presence of these gases suppresses what you would normally have gotten through a transparent atmosphere. Okay, fine. This, by the way, is a calculation, but if you measure from a satellite, you can hardly tell the difference. So we know how to calculate this very well. And there's not much mystery, room for error here. But what I want to point out to you is the black curve is for the present concentrations of all greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, ozone, nitrous oxide is in there somewhere. If you double carbon dioxide concentrations, you go from the black curve to the red curve, which is almost identical. So the entire effect of doubling CO2, which everyone is hysterical about, is the difference between this black curve and this red curve. That's the difference. Now, this really is not a very good sales pitch, if you're in the climate alarm business. So what the climate alarmists do is that they plot the difference between the black and the red curve, and then they multiply by a factor of 100 or 200 just so it looks like a big effect. But you should be aware of the fact that it's not a big effect. You can barely see the effect. Now, I've also plotted here a green curve. This is what happens if you take all the CO2 out. So if you imagine you could somehow remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, it really is a greenhouse gas, you can see that it makes a big difference. The green curve is quite a bit higher, so a lot more radiation would come to space if you took out CO2, and the Earth would cool a little bit. Yeah. But if you double it, it doesn't make any difference. So the technical term for this is that the CO2 absorption is heavily saturated at 400 parts per million, which is what is plotted here. It doesn't matter if you go to 800 parts per million, which is the red curve, or even 1600, you can hardly see the difference because it's absorbed all the easy radiation that it can get. And so the way the climate alarmist establishment gets around this is they say, well, okay, you're right, it's practically nothing, but it gets amplified by water. And you see that most of the greenhouse effect is actually due to water vapor over here, water vapor over here. And so the effect of, indirect effect of CO2 on water vapor make it dangerous. I can assure you that that's also nonsense, but I've probably, abused your patience of getting into the weeds a little bit too much. Same thing happens for methane here. This is what happens if you double methane. If you can hardly see that there is a red curve here for methane. This is the tiny effect of methane. And the greenhouse effect is, if you take all the methane out, there's the green curve here. Again, it's practically invisible. And yet they're going to put most of the natural gas business out of business in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, because of that tiny difference, which you can practically not see. Okay, so is this common sense? And the answer, of course it's not common sense. This is nonsense. I've often wished that I could claim to be a real Irishman, being of Scottish heritage. The Scots originally came from Ireland, but that was, more than 1,000 years ago, so we've kind of lost touch. But Jonathan Swift was a great Irish writer. And if you've not read Gulliver's Travel recently, it's worth reading. People think of it as a children's book, but it was not meant to be a children's book. We've just turned it into that. But he talks about his visit to this academic ideal, the land of Laputa. And here's what he says about the academics in Laputa. In these colleges, the professors contrive new rules and methods of agriculture and building, and new instruments and tools for all trades and manufacturers, whereby as they undertake one man shall do the work of 10, a palace may be built in a week of materials so durable as to last forever without repairing. All the fruits of the earth shall come to maturity at whatever season we think fit to choose, and increase 100-fold more than they do at present, with innumerable other happy proposals. The only inconvenience is that none of these projects are yet brought to perfection. And in the meantime, the whole country lies miserably waste, the houses in ruins, the people without food or clothes, by all of which, instead of being discouraged, there are 50 times more violently bent upon prosecuting their schemes, driven equally on by hope and despair. So this is the Green New Deal described by Jonathan Swift. This is one of my favorite cartoons, but here are the lemmings, and one of the politically incorrect ones says, wait a minute, something feels wrong, and they say, shut up, you moron, do as you've been told, it's for your own good, wear your mask, stop eating meat, etc. I'd like to hear, just take a minute, and it's not easy, as everyone knows, to stand up against the establishment. Jim Instrom has taken a real beating, but in the area of climate, nobody has been more unfairly beaten up than Willie Soon. So I just want to recognize Willie for his courage, for his honesty, and here's a famous German quote, goes back to the time of Martin Luther, je mehr Feinde, je mehr Ehre. So Willie, if you don't read German, it means the more enemies you have, the more honor you have. And so I'd like to applaud Willie. I hope you'll join me. Yeah. I'm glad to see that both Frank and Ben are there. Frank and Ben, you should be proud of your dad, and I hope you'll do just as well. I know you will. And I hope you don't have as hard a time. Okay. Well, I know it's getting late, so I'll try and finish up soon. This is not supposed to be a lecture. But let me remind you of the American Declaration of Independence. You know, right at the beginning, the first real paragraph, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And so you have to ask yourself, are these three fundamental rights still recognized today? Life, well, so far so good. You know, at least nobody's being executed like in the Soviet Union or guillotined like in France. Liberty, well, we've clearly lost a lot of liberty. I hope we'll get it back and that we won't lose more. Pursuit of happiness, well, it's pretty much gone. You know, being happy is really politically incorrect today. Although there are a few heretics here that are still playing the slot machines outside. Yeah. All right, so let me mention a few final reasons for optimism. I told Mark Morano, I happened to run into him in the hall, that you know, I'm not as pessimistic as many people are. I think there is good room for optimism. Jay Lehrer made that point earlier too. And so the first thing is that even if the elite have lost their common sense, many ordinary Americans have not. You know, when I go to get my hair cut, which I can do again now, the barber says, "What's all this crap I keep reading about masks and global warming? I've been gardening all my life. Nothing's happening, to the time I plant and the time I harvest. It's clearly nonsense." I said, "Well, you got that right, Joe." And so there are a lot of people like that, the truck drivers, so I don't give up on America. America is more than the East and West Coast elites and the readers of the New York Times and the Washington Post. A second clear historical fact is that people get tired of sanctimonious, politically correct elites. Again and again, these things get started. It's very unpleasant to live with it for a while. The Cromwell's Puritans, for example, just made life hell in England for, a generation. But soon after Cromwell died, the English rose up in anger and they called back the son of Charles I, and so the monarchy was back. It was not a very good choice, but it was better than Cromwell and his gang. The French Revolution, it burnt itself out within 10 years. Communist dictator of the Soviet Union lasted a bit longer, lasted 80 years or so, but it finally was thrown out too. So these things don't last forever. The shorter the better. Some are short, like the French Revolution. Some are a bit longer. Finally, Abe Lincoln said it right. You can fool all the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. And so we're part of the people, and I hope we'll stop this as soon as possible and return to common sense. So thank you very much for your attention. Yeah. Okay.
Carlos, a few questions, if you're willing to take a few.
Sure, yeah, happy to take.
Carl Langner, I just wondered about the three graphs that you presented on the COVID. those are very interesting, and I'd like to keep them and show them to my kids, for example.
Well, I put the web address down there, and if Jeremy could share the slides, you can read off the web address there.
Right.
It's CDC,
I know
data.
I could plot them myself.
Yeah.
But you did such a great job with it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's worth studying, yeah, and it gets updated every week. So it's interesting to follow it week by week. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. There's been a controversy on the one of the websites about the effect of water as opposed to carbon dioxide. And one of the comments was that the effect of water is about 100 times as much as carbon dioxide on the possible variation in changing the heat flux from radiating from the Earth.
Well, in the transparency I showed, the spectral plot where I called it the Schwarzschild plot, you can see on that the CO2 gap is about a half of the water gap. So I would say it's more like 2 or 3 to 1 water to CO2 if you measure it in that way. But the feedback issue is very important because they know without water feedback the whole thing is lost, and that's complete nonsense. I don't want to ruin the rest of the evening going into the details, but it has to do with how much water changes with altitude if you warm the surface a little bit. Yeah.
Great talk, Will, but I didn't know if you know that the Abraham Lincoln quote has been a little bit co-opted by the climate alarmists. You can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, and that's enough for me.
Thank you. Thanks, Cork. You always get the last word.
Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.
I guess I did want to recite, too, the same thing you said about Edward Teller. My son was a high school student. Edward Teller was at Livermore, and he would have classes.
Yeah.
And because of Edward Teller, my son went into physics, got a
Yeah.
physics degree at Cal. I was sitting at a table with a gentleman who got a PhD from Ohio State. Same thing. Edward Teller reached out to younger generations and
Right.
junior faculty, and that's a wonderful thing, and to see that happen with you. So I think you made a presentation at my alma mater, the University of California, Berkeley, the physics department.
Right.
And it seemed to go rather well. You seem to be relatively well embraced. Of course, I'm burned by Jim Enstrom's, very lamentable history of problems at UCLA. What was your experience at Cal with that lecture before, during, and after?
Well, that was 10 or 15 years ago. It's a long time ago, and things were not quite as tense then. And so I had many friends on the faculty. I had enemies, too, who demanded that I be disinvited, but, there were fewer of them than my friends, and so they invited me anyway. But I doubt I could go back to Berkeley now, because it's become just so political.
Even in the physical sciences, that's a lament, a concern.
Well, they're worried about their funding, and, there's some mean people out there who control the money bags. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Let me just say that I've read a lot of your dad's work, and I like it very much.
Well, thank you. I've read about 10%. He wrote literally faster.
He wrote a lot, that's
He
right.
wrote faster than I could read.
Yeah.
But so far I've outlasted him. So I've been following the same all-cause mortality data, and I post about it on Facebook or wherever, and my friends surprisingly remain unconvinced, and often they resort to, yes, but this disease has all kinds of dreadful consequences for people who do not die from it, and they could be lifelong, and what do you say to them?
Well, I don't know. I'm a physicist, not a medical doctor. But, many diseases have consequences that show up later. Polio was a famous example where if you had it as a young person, by the time you were 60 or 70, you started having trouble again. I don't see any evidence that COVID is like that. I mean, coronaviruses are all over the place. I mean, one of the most common common cold viruses is a coronavirus, and it doesn't cause any lasting effects. So I don't know why coronavirus should be so special. It's not the only, it's not the only coronavirus that we get infected with, and animals get various types of coronaviruses, dogs and cats, and you can have them immunized for it. There are vaccines for it. Doesn't seem to cause them very much harm. And
All
so
right.
I honestly don't know what the answer is, but I'm suspicious. It's a little bit like CO2. Someone pointed out today, well, yes, it makes plants grow better, but it makes poison ivy grow much better than anything else. So I think it's a little bit like that argument.
Yeah. People who want to be terrified will find something to be terrified of.
That's
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Very appreciate it.